Hey guys, and welcome to the Igloo. So this is my review for Conan Exiles, and later on down the road for what I've seen and for what was being perceived, especially for everybody that was new coming to Conan Exiles. This is a very important topic. Now, a lot of people don't do reviews down the line when it comes to video games because, again, it's not really a hot topic in a lot of people's minds. But again, I like this kind of stuff because it's a game that I love, as well as there is going to be as little bias as I can possibly do inside Conan Exiles from this point all the way until the end of the video. So we're going to get into it. One of the biggest things that was at the very beginning of Conan Exiles is that it was an early access open world survival game. Now, there was many different iterations of this, DayZ, Rust, and also just other games like H1Z1 and before they shut down, but that's a whole nother subject matter. But Conan Exiles had something different. It was just melee weapons. It was mainly melee weapons besides bows and a few other things, which really made the steeple to the game work well. And it just really tipped off for a lot of people. It was a lot of fun, and it had a lot of flaws, okay? Because, again, it's early access. You had people that were just spamming into the game, making sure everything else was like that, and it was just like, oh, it's a great time. The servers crashed multiple times. You had G-Portal services not even work half the time at the beginning. They didn't even have G-Portal at the very start because I had a different company when they were in early access, which was equally terrible, and it was just all over the place. So a lot of people left immediately. They paid the sponsors for a bunch of the popular streamers at the time, Twitch live streamers, and they're just like, yeah, here, play the game, market it, go. Are you sure? Have you tested about the game so that it doesn't run like a piece of shit? And at the very beginning, it actually was worse than Ark because you could only have like 50 players. At the beginning, there was 50 players, and it just could not run. There were server crashes, server restarts, and it was just all over the place mess. So then came a bunch of fixes, and the very notorious moment where they went from 50 players to 40 players. And this is because they overly estimated on how many things people would build and how big structures would be and how it would affect their single-threaded performance for the servers. And this is what came down to one of the biggest things, which they still have a problem to this day, is that they use an engine called Unreal Engine 4. It's a very diverse engine. It is a very robust engine. It's a very good engine, but it has a lot of limitations, especially on the server side, especially if they're not working with the engine developers themselves, Epic Games. So, when you are able to get everything else done antiquated, especially with launching a server, you would have multiple issues with it, especially if you're walking up to a new building for the longest time. So, people still played on official servers. There was a lot of griefing, there was a lot of ganking, there was a lot of things that have happened, and they still do happen, but not as hard as what they initially were at the very beginning. Chinese raids, everything else. You can look in the back of my video log channel on top of everything else on how crazy Conan Exiles was at the longest period of time. So then they evolved, and as soon as they evolved, they added new DLC for the north. They added a whole new biome, the frost biome, and then they eventually added the volcano as well as the swamp, or the swamp ghoul, because it was initially coined that at the very beginning. Once they added all this extra DLC stuff, it was a full, mighty, hefty game, and something that people really look forward to. And they released it in that kind of state for the longest time, even though they promised mounts would be a prevalent subject inside Conan Exiles. And because Conan Exiles was such a predominant figure inside a survival fighting integration, now again, it did not rival something like Ark, because of the community supported more Ark and they wanted to have more dinos. And you could have a lot more people on Ark, so you could have bigger mega tribes and stuff like that. Whereas Conan Exiles, especially on the official server side, stayed at 40 people. And again, they offered to try and fix more of their problems as possible, as well as they listened to me. There was a lot of times where I had to talk to the developers myself personally, where we had to fix something like undermeshing in different spots. Now, a lot of these fixes that they did were mainly to put big blocks and to not let them build there at all whatsoever, which is so that they can do a quick patchwork in order for them to have a equally enjoyable experience when it comes to different areas, when it comes to their 3D modeling, designing of the whole world structure, and then being like, oh wait, maybe they could actually go in there in the first place. Something that I've noticed for the longest time is that they did not have testers that actually just go through and test every little function and every way and every little small hole possible. They do a mainly general testing of a certain environment before it goes to beta test or test live, especially if you are on Steam. Something unlike for what Xbox and also PS4 had at the beginning. So, further in stating, once you are able to have a good amount of stuff and materials, they noticed that the game was being more popular because of all the extra content that they were adding. But it still had the one thing, and it still has the same thing, is that it's a single note. One of the most disappointing things is when they actually added an endgame, quote-unquote, which is pretty much a rebranding of Rip Bracelet, and to make a new character function that was to be happening. So you were needing to go from one point to another point to another point to collect a certain amount of things in order to put it in a temple, and then game over. Pretty much you have the bracelet, you take it off. There's not really a cinematic thing. There wasn't really an end boss that you really fight it, like a big old Dungeons and Quests kind of scenario where you could like prestige your character or something like that in order to still stay in the same land. You just exited the land, as well as some other resource materials which weren't really used in different points. Even though they were there, they could have been used for other things. Best example is when you are able to go and learn Jabral Seg. As an example, you have to take a serum. Now, there is a unused asset which could have been used, especially right across this whole exact area, just underneath the crystal caves, and you are able to get into this area. Well, not into this area per se, but you're able to activate it and make the portal happen. And I think that that would have been a better use of asset to fight and get into the Jabal Seg area, but again, they probably couldn't merge the resource in it at the same time. So we're getting to the more updated stuff as of recently. Once they realized that there was a need and urge for pets and mounting system, and even though people have been crying for mounts because they did promise it initially at the beginning, but again, it wasn't supposed to be recorded about his keynotes, especially for Conan Exiles, so expectations were still there even from day one of finding out what the hell Conan Exiles was. So because of all this information and because of how everything was perceived, we were still thinking when we were getting pets that we were going to be able to mount them on top of it. Yes, they were reusing assets that were in the game since launch, like the camel, and not really the horse, but you were able to use other animals and creatures that they were adding throughout the years in order to follow you. Now, a big thing that I've noticed, as well as a lot of other people noticed, is that they restructured the process when it came to thralls as well as other mechanics of following, especially you, in the world. Now, because the following mechanic was also related to pets, and pets were pretty much a copy and paste of the thrall whole entire structure system. Now, I'm not saying mechanically as in their walking, but I'm saying mechanically as their function. Follow, destroy, be passive, other things like that. they were able to pretty much copy one-to-one, and it realized this at the very beginning of this because, again, they had cloth clothing on top of everything else, and it was something that it was just crazy that they actually just replicated them as thralls. So people were getting antsy about thralls and gods. Now, gods were a very interesting subject throughout the ages. Gods were first OP, and then they nerfed them to the ground. So nobody really used gods, but then other people did use gods, especially on official servers, to show pretty much like alpha dominance, because archpriests were something that were really common, but then they weren't really common, and then they became super uncommon, and then they were okay common again, but again, they changed their values so much that it just didn't really work. There was also a point where you could always have bubbles up all the time, but then you couldn't have bubbles, and then the current state that we have is that if you have a bubble, it can still work, but at the same time, it could have problems and issues, especially with penetration of the actual bubble if you have a god that can, let's say, float above or below it on that same iteration. So, with that said, gods are still in a weird state, even though they are more useful now because vaults. Vaults were the biggest points of most of the controversies because they were OP, people were vault spamming everywhere. And one of the easiest things that you can do, especially with preventing a raid or having something that was an easier point, was to just make like maybe 5, 6, 7 vaults, just spam them all over the place. Something that was a big issue in the beginning as well as the current versions of Conan Exiles because of how spammy they were able to be perceived until their nerf on their HP. Once their nerf of their HP happened, all hell broke loose, everything was raided, and it was just a crazy time for a lot of servers where they lost a lot of things, and they had to restructure their bases to not just be for vaults, because vaults took up a big square footage compared to something like a chest, where you can have maybe 10, 11 chests, and then you can honeycomb and stack around them in a hidden space within a hidden space within a hidden space. So, again, it just made it so, why are you doing this kind of level? Why can't you just do something else? Why can't you just lock it up in another way? It just makes no sense. Something like also splash damage, where if you have a explosive or some form of explosive that is set off, you're able to see where everybody's health bars are because of collateral splash. And that's why that was a big issue from all the way at the beginning of the game until now. So because we're able to see health bars and pools above each character, it just makes it easier to see through walls as well as structures, because then you know where someone is hiding inside their foundations in any kind of shape or whatsoever. Now, there was the recent issue with having thralls that were not really super used in their system, but they weren't supposed to be there. So they also had the idea of deleting all those thralls on top of it. Again, I don't really play that in that kind of way now, but because of the deletion of those thralls that weren't supposed to be there, it just made some things, and it was just thrall wiping in every sense, where they're just like, no, you're not allowed on official servers to have these thralls, which weren't supposed to be intentionally given, even though they are extremely OP, and you're not allowed to have them now, which were mainly class 4 thralls throughout most of the lifespan of Conan Exiles. So then they're just like, you're not going to have them anymore. So for what the game is now, for what the game is coming up, there is going to be still the modding community, which is very supportive. One of the best modding communities, which is in there, which is still Pippi. Pippi was working almost hand in hand with the developers, pretty much helping fix their game in other ways and spotting bugs, not only on Pippi, but also on Source. So because you were having something that was a hand-in-hand kind of team, as well as like being able to see and perceive things, especially they were the ones that gave the external client so that you can actually download mods automatically and put it onto your server, and then you can just join the server and auto download all the mods that you need for that server. Again, this is why it makes it such a predominant figure. And at this point in the game, and also finding out other things, the game is really nice. It is worth a buy. What I would buy it for? $20. The game is worth $20. It's still a lot of work. You can definitely support them more if you want to have their DLC cosmetic skins. But again, it's something where it's down the line and they still have the server issues when it comes to stability, as well as just having more than 40 players has been such a limiting factor for them. 40 players is still not enough for most of Conan Exiles. Even though still fun and to have an RP environment, it still makes it a lot of different situations where you can enjoy, as well as having auto download mods especially. So again, if you guys like this kind of content, please leave a like, leave a comment down below, and have a good one, everybody.